Welcome in, everyone. Just going to give it a few minutes for people to join. Welcome to those of you just joining. We're going to start in just a couple minutes. If you need closed captioning, you can turn that on and off at the bottom of the screen. And if you have any tech-related questions, you can use the Q&A box to ask those questions. And I see someone was saying they have no sound. Hopefully that was just because none of us were talking. I hope you can hear us now. We'll give it one more minute and then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Really excited that you all are here today. My name is Olivia Catby. I work as the North America coordinator for the Palestinian Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Movement. I'm really excited to be moderating this discussion today. Big thank you to Jewish Currents and In These Times for hosting this discussion. As I mentioned, if you need closed captioning, you should be able to turn that on and off at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We're going to hear from the panelists today first, and then if there is time at the end, we might take a few questions from the audience. So if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A box. So just some background on why we're here today and how this discussion came about. As I'm sure many of you know, in 2005, Palestinian civil society organizations put out a call for boycott of, divestment from, and sanctions on Israel, or BDS. Which was premised on the simple principle that Palestinians are entitled to the same rights as the rest of humanity. And proponents of BDS took as a model the work of South African activists who mobilized economic sanctions against the apartheid regime. So now we're seeing the United States working with the EU and other countries to impose broad economy-wide sanctions on Russia in response to President Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And that has raised a lot of discussion for us in the movement and for those outside of it about how the Palestinian-led demand for BDS differs from these sanctions that are being imposed on Russia. So today we're going to explore some of these questions of the shared characteristics and differences of these various sanctions and really explore when sanctions are a tool for justice and when they're an instrument of violence. So today we'll be joined by Ronnie Casseroles. Ronnie was born in Johannesburg in 1938 and is a struggle veteran who served in the liberation struggle from 1960, attaining high posts in the SACP and ANC, including its military wing. He served in the Democratic government in ministerial posts from 1994 to 2008, and since then he has been involved as a political activist and particularly Palestine solidarity work, and is an author of several books. We'll also be joined by Lara Kiswani. Lara is the executive director of Arab Resource and Organizing Center, or AROC, serving poor and working class Arabs and Muslims across the San Francisco Bay Area and organizing campaigns such as Block the Boat and Stop Urban Shield. She is also a faculty member at the College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State University. And finally, we'll be joined by Omar Barghouti. Omar is a co-founder of the Palestinian-led Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Movement and a co-recipient of the 2017 Gandhi Peace Award. He holds a bachelor's and master's degrees in electrical engineering from Columbia University and is pursuing a PhD in philosophy ethics at the University of Amsterdam. He is the author of BDS, The Global Struggle for Palestinian Rights. So with that, I would like to go to Ronnie for our first question. Ronnie, can you describe the way that sanctions played a part in the South African anti-apartheid movement and what kind of sanctions on South Africa were implemented and how that contributed to the cause of ending apartheid?
Sure thing. In a tremendous way, BDS played a vital role reflecting international solidarity and pressure on governments across the world who were tightly involved with South African apartheid regime and played that decisive role over approximately 30 years to help achieve the change in South Africa with the demise of apartheid and the emergence of a democratically elected government of all the people. So just to remind everybody, the colonial conquest of South Africa goes back to the 17th century, the Dutch and then the British. By 1910, the British hand independence, but to the colonial settlers, the whites alone. By 1948, in the very same month that the Israeli conquest of the Palestinian lands takes place, the apartheid regime is elected in South Africa and intensifies the methods, the policy, the discrimination that has been taking place in a bloody way all those years before. By 1959, the development of the international boycott, divestment, sanctions program gets underway with an appeal in Britain, which is the major trading partner of South Africa, by Julius Nyerere, representing newly emergent and African states and states to become independent in the coming years. And it's a message from the ANC, leading the oppressed people of South Africa, to British people, basically saying, in his words, all we are asking is for you to begin to boycott South African products, to show the people in South Africa that you stand by them, and to begin a process of isolation of South Africa. Within a couple of years, the Sharpeville massacre took place in 1961, and that propels the boycott movement. It becomes the anti-apartheid movement in Britain, and that develops throughout the world. And the driving force behind it is both the struggling people of South Africa, represented by the ANC, and the African states, who are wholeheartedly in support. That is a very important aspect. The appeal and the advocacy is to people on a moral basis everywhere in the world to support the people of South Africa through boycott. And at a level of institutions, from the African Union, it was called the Organization of African Unity at that stage, to the United Nations, to mobilize at that level against South Africa, to apply the pressure. It develops into, very quickly, into comprehensive BDS, and the whole approach and objective is the isolation of South Africa, and of course putting on pressure of governments around the world, and they happen to be the same old suspects that the Palestinians face, and so many countless people have been facing over the years in terms of the discrimination, oppression, that they suffer from. And that's basically the former Western colonial powers and, of course, the emergent empire, the United States of America. To move quickly through this at two levels. The one is the institutional aspects, and I'll just quickly refer to keynote points in relation to the United Nations. So post-Sharpeville, the issues at the United Nations are taken up very vigorously by ANC spokespeople and others who are part of the anti-apartheid movement. And I must say, particularly faith-based groups and the Christian spokespeople, in particular at that time. So we see in 1962 an early resolution of many that are coming, and that's basically an appeal for comprehensive sanctions, boycott South Africa, divestment, sanctions itself, oil sanctions, arms sanctions, closing the doors of tourism and business and trade. This is all unanimously agreed, except for the usual suspects at the United Nations in the General Assembly. So it becomes a voluntary aspect. We see very quickly, by 1964, South Africa is kicked out of the Olympic Games. By 1970, after very vigorous boycotts and protests in Britain, we see the boycotting takes place throughout Western Europe, in particular, the main trading nations with South Africa, of the very symbolic Cape fruits and other South African fruits, such as grapes, oranges, and wines. And you get ordinary people and housewives and so on beginning to cross these off their shopping lists. It advances very quickly indeed, and with tremendous amount of peaceful protests outside the stores, etc. It's really getting through to the South African government, who's very defensive, and of course lashes are saying this is all a communist and terrorist conspiracy. What happens very soon is that in 1970, very direct action against South African sporting teams, their beloved cricket and rugby tours, get blocked in Britain very vigorously, which raises the whole tempo of direct action. This spreads to those countries that are the traditional sporting nations with South Africa, such as France and Australia, and particularly New Zealand, when in 1980, the last tours of the once idolized South Africans takes place to New Zealand. It has a huge psychological impact, inspiring the struggling people in South Africa and the African states, and a real blow to the ego, the self-esteem, psychological blow to the white electorate in South Africa and, of course, their government. We see back at the United Nations, particularly in the 70s, with the tempo of struggle, the South African Intifada, rising to greater heights of mobilization, protest, the huge repression, shooting down of people. What we see is from 1973, the General Assembly takes a resolution, a very important one, which declares South Africa a crime against humanity. That has direct implications for the Palestinian struggle and, in fact, for the Rome Statutes. That doesn't just say apartheid is a South African thing, but looks at apartheid everywhere in the world in terms of that form of statutory discrimination and brutality and so on against the people. In 1974, South Africa is booted out of the United Nations. I'll go very quickly in maybe a minute or two. I think I'll need 2 minutes to simply say that in the 1980s, it's very decisive what's been taking place across the continents is the divestment campaign. Trade unions, The churches in particular, remember South Africa is basically a Christian country, and the trade unions begin to divest from South Africa. It really is impacting. And then the date in 1977, by the way, I left it out, Security Council passes a mandatory sanctions of arms against South Africa, including assistance to South Africa with the nuclear weapon. A key country, Israel, goes against that and in a secretive way is involved in arming South Africa and the development of the nuclear weapon. To conclude, into the 80s, we see a tremendous development in the United States of America, bearing in mind the Black lobby there in Congress and amongst Black Americans, but of course Americans of all colors. But that particular aspect is very vital. And by 1986, against Reagan's position, Congress passes the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act, which is sanctions across the board. And you get American firms divesting. You move to the real final crunch blow out of Chase Manhattan and then Barclays in Britain, where the banks sever ties with South Africa and they call in their debts and they don't apply credits. Just to quickly say that in the United States, something like it's 28 states become party to these sanctions and over 100 cities. It leads to this reinforcement of the mass struggle of the South African people, which forces apartheid into absolutely backpedaling and making its concessions, releasing Mandela, lifting the bans on organizations, dropping apartheid, which is what the objective of BDS has been about. So that the ANC then says in 1991, we can lift this whole sanctions issue against apartheid because in a peaceful way, it's assisted in this major sea change. And we go on in 1994 to the first democratic elections, which sees the emergence of a democratic South Africa. So I've had to rush through all that, but these are the highlights of what you, in my response of what you've asked me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that huge overview in such a short amount of time. Omar, I want to go to you now. So the Palestinian boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which you co-founded, takes its inspiration from the South African anti-apartheid movement. Can you describe what the BDS movement calls for and specifically what it means when we call for sanctions on Israel?
Yes, thanks, Olivia, and thanks so much, Ronnie, for this very brief history of South Africa, which is truly inspiring. Indeed, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or BDS movement, which was launched by the absolute majority of Palestinian society in historic Palestine as well as in exile, what was inspired very much by the South African anti-apartheid movement and the global solidarity movement, which manifested itself mainly in boycotts, divestments, and eventually sanctions, but also the US civil rights movement played a very important, inspiring role. But the key inspiration for BDS was our own Palestinian heritage of popular resistance to British colonialism and later to Zionist settler colonialism, where boycotts were used for decades to fight against colonialism, ethnic cleansing, and so on. While inspired, it's not a copy-paste type of thing, and there's never a copy-paste in any struggle. In the South African case, for example, there are key differences that some people may not know about. In South Africa, the boycotts were blanket against everything and everyone South African. Personally, I was active when I was in school at Columbia University in New York in the anti-apartheid movement led by Black students at the time, actually. And I do remember vividly how the boycott applied to everything South African. It was not very targeted. It was a total blanket boycott. In contrast, the BDS movement calls for targeted boycotts based on complicity, not identity. And that's a key difference between BDS and the South African anti-apartheid boycotts. In the cultural sphere, academic sphere, sports, and everything, it's based on complicity. on representation of the State of Israel as an apartheid settler colony or complicit institutions in that Israeli regime of military occupation, settler colonialism, and apartheid. One major difference comes to the issue of sanctions. I don't know if we'll discuss it later, but just to explain a very important point, because that's a very contested issue. The BDS calls for S. The S in BDS is sanctions. But US-led sanctions, NATO-led sanctions have devastated nations, have killed hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people in countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, and so many other nations. Is this what BDS is calling for? Absolutely not. As a movement that is very ethically consistent and that is in line with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we absolutely adhere to the key criteria of legality and morality of sanctions. In other words, for sanctions to be legal and moral, they've got to be targeted to end the system of oppression, not to hurt ordinary people. They cannot be designed to hurt ordinary people, and they cannot ignore the suffering of ordinary people. They have to be proportionate to the crime committed. When sanctions like the US-led sanctions against Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, Iraq in the past, and so on, target food, medicine, necessities, that is absolutely designed to harm people, to cause immense suffering, or in Iraq, to cause genocidal suffering, when hundreds of thousands of people are intentionally left to die because of US sanctions. That's genocide. This is absolutely abhorrent, and this is antithetical to the very ethical foundations of the BDS movement. So it's important to say that. So BDS calls for boycott, divestment, sanctions to end the occupation, to end the system of Israeli apartheid, and to popularize and eventually lead to the implementation of the right of Palestinian refugees to return. And as an anti-racist, inclusive movement, we're very much opposed to all forms of racism and discrimination, very much like the South African anti-apartheid movement. To end, I mentioned the US Civil Rights Movement. A key principle that we've learned from the US Civil Rights Movement is what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said when describing boycotts. He said, at the very basic level, boycotts are equivalent to withdrawing cooperation with an evil system. And when you think about that, it's about ending complicity, which comes way before sanctions. Forget sanctions. The very immediate thing that states need to do and interstate organizations need to do is end their complicity in the perpetuation of this regime of oppression and apartheid. So that's the key demand of the BDS movement, but we can get to the sanctions part later.
Thank you so much, Omar. Lara, I want to go to you now. As a very dedicated, principled anti-imperialist here in the heart of US empire, I'm wondering if you can describe how you feel sanctions on Israel might or might not differ from the sanctions the West often imposes on its enemies, as we've been discussing, and is imposing now on Russia.
Yeah, thank you. And it's an honor to be alongside comrades and movement leaders in this conversation. I want to start by saying there's spelling out the difficulty of answering this question. I think we're all here thinking through this together and grappling with these questions so we can be practically acting in solidarity and acting as internationalists in this moment. First to say that, we know that politics is not divorced from racialization of this world. And within this world, let's situate sanctions as a tool and not a neutral one to advance particular interests, right? And so for those of us in the US who've been advocating for BDS for decades, we now know very well and have been appalled, even understanding the US-Israeli partnership and its commitment to Israeli Zionism and settler colonialism, still are very stunned at the utter hypocrisy that we are witnessing today, right? But the limitations of sanctions don't come from the people who use them, they come from the systems that produce them. And I want to just get into some of the context here, right? So sanctions, boycotts, embargoes, can be understood as an escalation of tactics, right? Or intensified form of politics, as has been mentioned. And they're tools used by one entity against another, or many forces against another, or one entity against many forces, with the aim of isolation. Now, what's important is to distinguish sanctions called for and advanced by a popular movement and those that are conceived of and mobilized by states, let alone an imperialist state like that of the United States. So what is the role and function of sanctions when movements call for them? And what is the role and function of sanctions when an imperial power calls for them? Motivations and ends of these two forces are entirely different. The balance of power through which sanctions are a tactic is obviously different through these two different terrains. State imposed sanctions can be understood as a political maneuver. From our perspective, from the progressive of social movements, the outcomes of sanctions shouldn't be to make a better client state for the United States. The outcome of sanctions should be to make the state serve its people, right? And boycotts and sanctions led by social movements are tied to those types of political demands, whether we're talking about the civil rights era, the fight against apartheid, so South Africa, the great boycott by United Farm Workers, right? The Indian movement against British colonialism, ongoing union pickets, or the intifadas and the BDS movement in Palestine today. People's calls for sanctions are an attempt by a group of people to say, you are wronging me, and I'm going to take action by the very thing you're trying to achieve by wronging me to disrupt the economy and society and isolate your ability to exert political dominance, right? So we can think of sanctions or embargoes as being used as bargaining pressure for political dominance. That ranges from the United States putting pressure on Iran to the United States putting pressure on Venezuela, Cuba, or even Iraq. One goal is to completely restructure and fundamentally change the nature of the regime. The other is a way to pressure it to get particular demands. There's also the case that we know in many cases where the polity is falling, such as South Africa, and the only way to stay ahead of the curve is to support this popular movement, as we saw with the United States and other Western forces around South Africa. And then there's the swell of popular support in an incredible moment that changes the tide, like, for instance, the civil rights era here in the United States, right? So understanding sanctions as a political tool of the people to exert a political win. I want my freedom, and I'm going to force you to it. Now, the state and those who use those tools of power are going to do whatever they can to fight you in order to be able to obligate you to fit in this world order. And let's keep in mind that our people and people fighting for freedom will always demand it. So in the case of Russia, I'd argue that the formula is a bit different. In this imperial world order, the country with overwhelming global power, the United States, is exerting political dominance. You have the largest imperialist government with the largest military in the world mobilizing its policymakers to call for sanctions on another country. Sanctions against Russia are part of an economic warfare against economies and governments that the United States finds or perceives it to be an actual hegemonic threat. And the end goal of Russia's sanctions is to isolate a country that is trying to compete with far less power than the United States. And historically, state-imposed sanctions were used to discipline states into a particular order, not a radical anti-colonial or anti-capitalist order. They were meant to put states in line so they don't disturb that order. And when we as movements use it as a vehicle, we are doing so in a very different terrain, in a very different way. And we know that historically the logic of sanctions is not meant to discipline states to make them more democratic. They're meant to discipline states into that order. And we would be naive not to know that the United States interests are void and disjointed from what is popular, moral, or ethical. In the case of human rights, sovereignty, freedom of people, against war and occupation, the US is completely and utterly morally bankrupt. Now, in the case of Palestine and sanctions against apartheid Israel, rather than say or make the case of why we should sanction Israel, that's become obvious even to the most moderate human rights organizations such as Amnesty International. We're using a tool that's been historically used to discipline states into conforming to the imperial order, to actually chip away at US imperialism and strengthen movements for democracy. So fundamentally, calls for sanctions against Israel are calls for a new world order, to make room for redistribution of economic and political priorities, and an attempt to undo colonialism and to strengthen movements for democracy and self-determination. And we know already today there's consensus across social justice movements that Palestine is central to any movement against racism, militarism, capitalism. So how do we put that solidarity into action? Through our power, through our labor power, through our community solidarity, by interrupting international commerce, interrupting global capitalism. And we believe, and as has learned by our comrades in South Africa, that we can rupture Zionist hegemony here in the US, that we can deepen that wedge between the corporate elite and the working people, and that there are avenues that we can pursue to put pressure on decision makers, such as boycott, divest, and sanctions. but also to move the masses, right, towards a political vision free of exploitation of all people. And that's what BDS is about, right? That's why it's such a critical vehicle today to fight for freedom and for international solidarity. And in our view, the BDS movement is succeeding in isolating Israel politically and culturally. And as we see, while apartheid Israel is more and more isolated internationally, the US and Israel are seeking to normalize relations with Israel regionally through corrupt Arab regimes. So BDS against apartheid Israel is a popular tool, demanding the international community to hold Israel accountable. If we understand the US-Israeli partnership, then we understand that the normalization efforts, coupled by criminalizing laws of BDS, over 120 right now in this country, is a way to thwart this democratic call for sanctions. But in this case, who has the power to punish? Who has the power to sanction, right? Western imperial powers do, not Palestinians, just like Yemen wouldn't be able to sanction Saudi Arabia or the United States, right? If we apply this to the case of Russia, Iran, and Cuba, and Venezuela, then it really helps us understand and situate the double standard, as we've been calling it, around Israel. And if we understand imperialist imposed sanctions as an act of war, when activists call for it, when movements call for it, they don't call for it within that same register because they don't have the same power. It's something else. It's alerting the international community to a real undemocratic state, to a set of conditions, to a contradiction, and to call for isolation of a settler colony, not to exert or reproduce imperial interests in this country and in the world.
Thanks so much for that, Lara. Omar, I want to give you a chance to follow up on what Lara just said, and especially, kind of getting more into the nitty gritty of like the way that the S in BDS might or might not differ from sanctions on Russia and the other sanctions imposed by the US and other Western powers that we've been talking about.
Yes, thanks, Olivia. Just before getting into that, Lara mentioned a very important point, which is the connection between Palestinian liberation and other justice struggles. And Lara mentioned the anti-BDS laws in the US. I want to connect those 2 points because, as everyone knows now, Israel's legal warfare or lawfare against BDS, which has been mobilized in tens of state legislatures across the United States, are being used as templates to fight activists against fossil fuels, activists for women's rights, activists against the gun lobby. Every progressive cause is being fought now with the same templates used to fight BDS. I remember in 2017, we had warned exactly about that scenario. The BDS movement warned that those who think McCarthyism 2.0, the Israel-induced repression, anti-democratic violation of the First Amendment of the US Constitution against advocacy of Palestinian rights through BDS in the United States, those who thought this lawfare against BDS will only hit the Palestinians and the Palestine Solidarity Movement are dead wrong. If it passes, they will use it and against every progressive cause. Indeed, that's what we're seeing today in Oklahoma and Arizona and Texas across the United States. So I just wanted to get that. Now, when we get to the sanctions details, now sanctions are imposed by states or interstate organizations. Unlike popular boycotts or institutional divestments, they have to be imposed by states or the United Nations or the EU or major international entities. To get to the sanctions, we need to build power from the grassroots up. We need to build, as Ronnie mentioned, with faith communities, with trade unions, with social justice movements, racial justice movements, and so on, to connect the dots between our struggles and other justice struggles, not because of some opportunistic need to work with them, but really out of a conviction that justice for one is justice for all, and we need to band together against a common enemy. Imperialism, savage capitalism, and so on, that's oppressing all of us. And Israel is part of that map. So what we called for, when we call about ending complicity, as I said, this comes even before sanctions. Ending complicity is an absolute, profound moral obligation. It's not a charitable act. So sanctions might take the shape of announcing that Israel is a state that we will not trade with, for example, on X, Y, and Z. We will not sell weapons to Israel. We will not buy weapons from Israel, and so on. But there's the complicity that even comes before that. The United States gives Israel military funding worth $3.8 billion a year. Cutting that would be the first step. That's not a sanction. That's fulfilling a legal, moral obligation to do no harm to us. The United States government is doing immense harm to the Palestinians by funding, defending Israeli apartheid and settler colonialism, and making sure that no state on earth dares to hold Israel accountable to international law. We need to end that complicity even before talking about sanctions. But the kind of sanctions we talk about, again, must be lawful, must be targeted and proportional. For example, military embargoes. For a state to announce a two-way military security embargo on Israel. Israel's military sales to the world, Israel's security, technology, doctrines, and apps sold to the world are field tested on Palestinians and sold mostly to repressive governments, to dictatorships, to death squads, to all sorts of horrific regimes around the world to commit a lot of repression, to deny people their rights, even sometimes to kill activists, to deny women activists, LGBT activists, and so on, their basic rights, as we're seeing across the world, including the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Central America, India, and many states in the African continent. So Israel's sales of those military technologies, security technologies are a threat to peoples around the world, especially in the global south, not just to Palestinians. Yes, they field test them on us, but they sell them to dictatorships and authoritarian regimes that use them against all peoples. So there's a common interest there of imposing such military embargoes on Israel. And there's an intersectional approach that it's in the interest of those African states, Latin American states, South Asian states, not just for the Palestinian state, but for their own sake. But again, we would never endorse or condone or call for sanctions that harm ordinary people, like medicine, food, basic construction materials, and so on and so forth. That would be illegal and that would be unethical. And so we make a very clear distinction there between what we call for and what the US and other imperialist powers have been doing against mostly peoples of color in the global south.
Thanks so much for that, Omar. Ronnie, I want to go back to you now. I'm wondering how you see these kinds of sanctions that the BDS movement is calling for as similar to the sanctions imposed against South Africa, and do you see them as different from the sanctions we've discussed here that the US and Western powers often impose on their enemies?
Yeah, well, sure. I mean, in short, the similarity between the morality of BDS as used against apartheid South Africa and BDS as being used against Zionist settler apartheid Israel is very, very similar and out of the same league, the same approach, morally based, looking at grassroots to apply pressure on governments that were party, and in both cases, party to strengthening apartheid South Africa and apartheid Israel. Totally impunity given, particularly in the latter case. In terms of, and cutting to the chase, what we're discussing today and why we get to this particular subject today is very relevant. And I'm going to say under 3 points about the United States, the empire, and Omar has referred to its brutality and cruelty. And there are many differences between BDS of a just cause based on the people, the morality and ethical approach, etc. And that's the cruelty, absolute cruelty, inhumane cruelty of the way the Western powers, former colonial, and particularly led by the USA, the cruelty of their sanctions. Do we remember Madeleine Albright and her statement that 500,000 Iraqi children died because of the kind of sanctions imposed by the USA, she said it was worth it. 60 years of a blockade of Cuba, of what's happening to Afghanistan, Iran, and the denial in relation to Gaza and the Palestinians in the West Bank, in relation to medicines, sufficient fuel, sufficient food, starvation. This is all about absolutely removing these people, as is the case with Russia. Absolute cruelty that's being imposed against ordinary people. The question of how you advocate that people and the world, the global community, from states to the grassroots organizations, getting on board behind your call for BDS, a la South Africa and the Palestine issue, not by blackmail, not by bullying, not by, as the Serbian leaders said the other day, that they were not going to vote for the UN resolution at the UN, the US resolution. But he was threatened, as many of the states in Africa, and to their credit, so many refused to go along with the warmongering of the United States, and that's the cruelty of its sanctions, the immorality. And then the final point, the fact that the US and NATO are playing with nuclear fire. They are prepared to arm countries bordering on Russia. We don't support Russia's invasion. We don't like to see people made refugees and buildings being leveled. But, you know, if you look at the case, just listen to John Mearsheimer and so many others, from Scott Ritter and the Monthly Review's latest articles about how Russia has been set up and had to respond. The Chinese say they believed Russia's case, but that Russia should have used all the political options before taking this particular step. But we have to take that into account. And the fact is, when I say the difference, this is warmongering, and it's pushing nuclear threats and the nuclear button. And we're coming close to that. And who's responsible? This has been part of the NATO and the US strategy and approach from the time that the Soviet Union collapsed. And of course, it goes back to other American neoconservatives from earlier periods, saying that we will use the nuclear weapon in various ways to get rid of Russia. And that was in the Cold War, the Soviet Union. And now post that, after all their promises to the Russian leaders, including this man Putin now, that NATO would not encroach on their border. It's come to that. I'm not condoning it, but we're in a situation now in terms of what counts. Is it the outcome of the sanctions policy of the Palestinian movement and the ANC-led South African Liberation Movement, which was not about warfare and certainly nowhere near nuclear conflagration, unless you leave it up to Zionist Israel in the way it's playing along with America and using nuclear threats. But it was about pushing towards and coercion towards a peaceful solution. That the moment in which, whether it's apartheid Israel as with apartheid South Africa, that they show that they're willing to go into reform, that they will change an apartheid system in both cases. This is what BDS on Israel is all about. And they see it in relation to South Africa, that in the end, when it came to the fact that the apartheid rulers were prepared to dismantle an apartheid system, already 3 years before that big election for democracy that brought in Mandela in 1991, after the lifting of the bans, the freeing of political prisoners, etc., the ANC, I was at the conference in 1991, we had quite a debate. In the end, because of our morality at that point, we said, yes, we agreed to Mandela's leadership that we should now be prepared to lift sanctions because it's a different ball game. So it was the question, as I know from Omar Barghouti and the BDS movement on Israel, that is the objective. It's a political, diplomatic solution. And we don't see this from NATO and the USA, do we? Not at all. Those are the differences, and they are absolutely essential differences, why we need to defend our BDS campaign against Israel and why we need to stop NATO and the USA in its tracks before we get to a point of no return.
Thank you so much, Ronnie. Lara, I want to give you a chance to follow up on anything that Ronnie and Omar have just said. And I also want to give you room to feel free to disagree, raise questions, or identify areas where there might not be consensus.
Well, I actually just want to add to something that Omar laid the groundwork for around the U.S.-Israeli partnership, right? And how does that play out in terms of our attempts or efforts to move and advance boycott, divestment, and sanctions everywhere? So just to echo that the U.S.-Israeli partnership is very much a relationship of the global elite, the corporate class, right? It's rooted in racial capitalism. And that's why the U.S. is deeply invested in maintaining Israel as a proxy state in the global south. And in turn, Israel is invested in maintaining its over $3.8 billion of military and economic support each year. And the U.S. is invested, as Amar said, in using Palestine as a laboratory for weapons, surveillance technology, and crowd control tactics by the state of Israel. And Israel's invested in exporting that to the rest of the world. And that's why most police departments, right, train with Israel. And that's why the apartheid Israel state used the playbook of the United States in the colonization of this land. And we also know that the way to disrupt that is through worker community solidarity, through international solidarity, that we can, in fact, disrupt these systems of oppression. And BDS can be that avenue and vehicle that we force the hands of Western states to do so. But how do we do that? How do we do that? Is through mass pressure. Because again, sanctions is a framework limited to state powers. Who has the power to sanction? States do. In order to get the United States to sanction Israel, we have to build out mass pressure and make the state act in such a way, right? The state acts when there's a swell of popular support, such an incredible tide that they can't turn their eyes, right? To the point where they have to either join or pay the consequences, which for them, they have to have a set of, assessments that it is actually worse for them to not support this popular movement than it is to support the popular movement. For an example, we can use the civil rights movement here in the United States as that. And BDS builds on those efforts, builds on the fights against apartheid and the fights for democracy and civil rights, as well as anti-colonialism. And we have to understand that right now it's imperative that not only to understand BDS as in an attempt to isolate apartheid Israel economically, politically, and culturally, and I see some questions in the question box about the distinctions between those, but ultimately the end goal is to strengthen the solidarity movements against exploitation, right? Strengthen movements against against occupation and against dispossession and towards sovereignty and self-determination. But in order for us to do that, I think we have to grapple with some hard questions around our own understanding of imperialism, our understanding of the global political economy, the contradictions that emerge, right, from global capitalism, and what can we as a strong left do to support struggles for sovereignty and for peoples against colonialism. It's not just about taking positions, right, on imperialism or anti-imperialism. I think it's time for us now to come up with an anti-imperialist strategy, something that Palestinians and others have helped advance for decades, right? And in this moment, that's really the question at hand, is let's talk about the world order that makes it possible for the United States to sanction anybody, anytime it wants, right? And what can we do today to force the international community to sanction Israel and to sanction to strengthen democratic movements? That's ultimately the goal. And that's the primary contradictions between these two different forms of sanctions. It's not just the impact it's going to have, it's also the motivations behind them.
Thanks, Lara. So I just want to give each of you a few more minutes if you'd like to add on or respond to something someone else has said, or make some closing remarks, you can do that now. So I'll go to Omar first.
Yes, thanks, Olivia. Just one last remark is that people in the United States, since this is for a US audience, have a responsibility because your government, your quasi-democratically elected, whatever you call it, government, is the reason why Israel's regime of oppression against Palestinians continues. It's the main reason. I mean, Europe, of course, is very complicit, but it's the US complicity first and foremost that's maintaining this regime against us. This means you have a moral responsibility to act, to offset this complicity. You cannot control where your tax money is going. Indeed, the massive military budget that was just passed, you cannot control it directly, but you can offset the complicity of your government, your institutions, by working within your spaces, universities, centers, communities, cities, to end that complicity. So there's a moral responsibility to do everything possible to end complicity in Israeli apartheid and to fight against the $3.8 billion in military funding to Israel. That's the first step. And there are many other steps, but that's a very first step. And as I said, this is not just for the sake of Palestinians. This is the sake of all justice movements in the United States and everywhere.
Thank you so much, Omar. We will go to audience questions after this. Ronnie, do you have anything additional you'd like to add?
Yeah, just very brief, 2 points. One is that we mustn't feel that because we're opposing US, NATO sanctions, that means that we shouldn't be supporting sanctions in relation to Israel. They are the two different things, as Laura made out. It's like needing to know. We talk about international solidarity. International solidarity can be the solidarity of the progressive popular forces fighting for justice. It can be the solidarity of big business. It can be the solidarity of Nazis, of fascists. So the question of sanctions then is, what is the character? Is the question of imposing sanctions something that promotes peace or promotes war and cruelty? And there you see the distinct differences between the BDS movement in relation to Israel, in relation to apartheid South Africa. We must be very clear about that. My last point is the absolute double standards of the usual suspects. And who are they? They are the real imperialists who have a colonial legacy, the colonial powers of Western Europe and the colonial past and imperialist presence of the United States. And we know what we mean when we say the hypocrisy and the duplicity, because if they had moved against Israel in a minor way compared to the way they're moving, at an absolute snap of their finger, how everybody has got into line in terms of Europe, and then the support of parts of Africa, and I mentioned Serbia, etc., because they'll be clubbed and they'll suffer themselves if they don't give the support of the UN. It's happening there in Europe and so on. The absolute hypocrisy and the duplicity. And that's where we must call them out, because we've got a great weapon now in terms of accusing the European Union, who are so on board with NATO and the USA, and demand that they need to do what the Egyptian squash player, this world champion squash player, said when he was asked about what's happening in the Ukraine. And he simply said, I don't like seeing war. I don't like seeing bombs dropped on houses and on people, and I don't like seeing refugees. But why are they not applying this to the people of Palestine and elsewhere in the world? Thank you.
Absolutely, Ronnie. Thank you for that. Lara, we'll go to you now, if you have any closing remarks.
Yeah, I would just say that despite all of this, the contradictions, the double standards, the hypocrisy, right? Also the uphill battle we are now facing, there's an opening here. There's an opening for all of us, particularly here in the United States, in the belly of the beast, to advance BDS. People are discussing sanctions in ways we haven't heard before, and boycotts in ways we haven't heard before. And what does that mean for us, progressive movements trying to advance liberatory strategies, right? Now is an opportunity for us to actually hold accountable our elected officials and our institutions here in the United States, which play a large and instrumental role in making possible the occupation of Palestine and the apartheid regime, to advance calls for BDS. It's not, we can talk all we want about the double standards and hypocrisy, but ultimately our end goal, as Rani and Omar have laid out, is for the well-being of all exploited peoples, to fight for a real democracy against colonialism and to fight people's self-determination and sovereignty. And we have an opening for that today, especially here in the United States. It's incumbent on us to take this energy that we are seeing for solidarity with Ukraine towards all people of the global South, and in particular understand what the significance is of isolating Israel within the larger world order. What that means for us as people fighting for social justice is also chipping away at US imperialism, and that's a duty for all of us today.
Thank you, Lara. We are going to go to audience questions for a few minutes now, and I think this question we got really relates to what you were just saying, Lara. The BDS movement recently released a statement condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine as illegal and immoral. But the question of what it means to show solidarity and empathy with Ukrainians seems to be a contested one. So how can we show solidarity with those subjected to the Russian invasion without escalation and harmful sanctions? And anyone can feel free to jump in and take that.
Well, I'll start us off by saying you support the people of Ukraine by being against war, right? We are all part of an anti-war movement. Fundamentally, being pro-Palestine is being anti-war. Being against apartheid Israel is against war. And so to support any people at the receiving end of warfare, our calls should be to end war and not to do anything that escalates warfare, which in this case, economic sanctions would.
Yeah, sure.
Rani and Omar, anything you'd like to add to that? No.
I totally agree. That is the way to help the people in Ukraine, and that's what the program and the everything should be: an anti-war movement, peace, and negotiations towards peace. This is the key issue now. It's not a question, for goodness sake, of responding to Zelensky and the rest of the gang saying, we need foreign volunteers, come and fight for us. People say to me, Ronnie, you talk about solidarity all over the world, etc., all these places, Palestine. Now, what about going and providing solidarity there? Two different things. Can you imagine going and joining a force where you're rubbing shoulders with Nazis? Because most of their mercenaries are from that kind of background anyway. It's about a peace movement. I totally agree with Laura and with Omar. I mean, that's obviously our line and our approach, and it's a just and correct one.
Thank you, Ronnie. There was a question from Mark Braverman, shout out Mark. He said, would like to hear from Ronnie and Omar in response to Lara's distinction between economic measures employed by states as power politics as opposed to popular movements for justice. Although originating as a popular movement, powerful states, the USA and the UK in particular, participated through sanctions and were key in ending South African apartheid. So what role, if any, can the US play here if we look at the South African experience? And Lara, would you question the role of the US and other states as inimical to the goals of BDS? Omar, if you want to jump in on that one first.
Sure. Yes, I think that the question answers itself. Absolutely. The US, the UK played a very important role in ending the apartheid regime in South Africa when they finally joined the growing consensus around the world and finally imposed sanctions against the apartheid regime. But as Lara said, that took a lot of building power from beneath. Again, I was personally involved in that movement when I was a student, and I saw from my tiny little place how it played out. even at a university, it took years to convince the trustees to divest from companies involved in apartheid, years of massive mobilization supported by the community, churches, trade unions, social movements in the community around the university to get the trustees to act. So imagine what it took Congress to act. So indeed, yes, imperial powers have all the power to impose targeted lawful sanctions to help us change, to help us end a system of oppression and to live in freedom, justice, and equality. But it takes coercion from beneath, building grassroots power. It's all about power, ultimately, because Congress, the White House, they don't understand morality in general, with a few exceptions in Congress, I would say. They understand power. They understand how they get elected the next time. So we need to show them power. Constituents need to show them power.
Ronnie, do you have a response?
Yeah, well, just briefly, just to reinforce Omar, since they referred to the South African situation, you know, the United States and Britain and Germany, West Germany, that was in France, they actually found all sorts of loopholes, how to get around the fact of mandatory sanctions, actually. What really counted was that it was business like Barclays, Chase Manhattan, Kodak, Polaroid, many different businesses. The Dunnes Store strike in Ireland, which was selling South African fruit, and there was a protest by the 12 women assistants in the store who refused to sell those fruits, which then forced the Irish government to declare a ban on South African fruit, etc. So it was the grassroots, the African Americans civil rights movement has been said in the USA, that pushed those companies. And finally, it was the fact that business was bad for the big companies and the banks, which is why they then withdrew. It wasn't so much the magnanimity of the British and the American government, but of course it was embarrassing for them, and they had to start toning down their support for South Africa. So it's grassroots is key, but pressurize the governments that are in league with these barbarians, in this case, Zionist Israel.
Thanks, Ronnie. Lara, do you have anything to add to that?
Just that, Western imperialist forces are the architects of Israeli apartheid and settler colonialism in Palestine. So, of course, it's going to be a hindrance to understand their role as a hindrance. But that's why, back to the points that have already been made, it's the grassroots power that will force their hands to actually see to our demands, not the other way around. And we can't expect the US or any imperialist power for that matter to have the moral high ground. Here it is on the movements to demand more and to pressure them to be able to see to the calls of the masses, which has been done in the past. We have, lessons from the past that we can learn from today. And to also name, to Ronnie's point, the global economy has shifted. So what was possible with South Africa may not be possible in the same way. And as Ahmed said, there's no blueprint for this work, but we're learning as we go and also modeling efforts based on what has worked and fundamentally now understanding what openings there are to call out these contradictions and put more pressure on electeds, whether or not their political interests are in alignment with ours. It's not even about having alignment with the political interests of the US government. It's about forcing them to see to our demands.
Absolutely, Lara. Thank you for that. I think that is a great place to leave it. We're just a few minutes over the hour. So I want to thank our incredible panelists, Omar, Ronnie, Lara, for joining us today. Thank you so much to the audience for tuning in, and big thank you again to Jewish Currents and In These Times for hosting this discussion today. You will be able to find this conversation online. It will be on the Jewish Currents YouTube page and also on the event page where you registered after the webinar ends. So thank you so much again, everyone.